Hi, my name is Jen Van Amerongen. This is Torah Exchange, and this week's Parsha is Parashat VaEtchanan. In this week's Parsha, the Dibrot comes up. And it's interesting because we would expect to find the Dibrot in a different Parsha, which we do. It's also found in Parashat Yitro, which is its original location, because that's the story of Har Sinai, Bnei Israel hearing the Dibrot, receiving Moshe bringing the Luchot down from Har Sinai, and receiving the Torah for the first time. So many commentators ask, why are the Dibrot repeated again in Sefer Devarim in Parashat VaEtchanan, which is the 40th year in the desert when Bnei Israel are about to go into Eretz Israel? So many commentators ask this, and one of the important questions they ask also is, why are there so many differences between the two different sets of Dibrot? There are little differences such as additions of letters or changes of some words, and many commentators ask what the reason is for those changes. But there are also larger differences between the two sets. For example, the one I'll be speaking about today, the difference between the two reasons given for why we keep Shabbat and how to keep Shabbat. So there are many different approaches to this question and this problem. Some of them discuss the fact that the first set of Luchot, the first Aseret HaDibrot, was said by Hashem. And Sefer Devarim, many refer to as the Mishnah Torah. It's the Sefer that was given more over in Moshe's own voice and Moshe's own words. So many commentators attribute many of the differences to the fact that Moshe just used different words than Hashem did to describe the Aseret HaDibrot. And they say that this isn't really a problem because, first of all, many of the smaller changes are just natural changes that would come up when a narrator is telling a story. They're not going to say it the exact same way the original person said it, and it doesn't mean there's huge differences. They're just small little differences in words that people would use, and they don't really mean anything important. Another approach to this question is that actually the Aseret HaDibrot were, and this is the approach of the Gemara, that they were really said at the same time. Even though they're different words in one place, it says Shamor ad Yom HaShabbat L'Kacho, the other place it says Zachor. Actually, we said Shamor v'Zachor b'Divrei Echad Namru. They were both said at the same time by Hashem. So this is a more mystical or omni-significant way of explaining these differences. This isn't just human, natural changing of words, but actually Hashem said both at the same time, but as humans, we can't read the same words, hear the same words at the same time, so it was just written in two different places. One idea that I thought was very interesting that I was looking at was that of the Hoel Moshe, Rav Moshe Ashkenazi, a 19th century exegete from Italy. And he explains, and I'll just focus on one of the differences, the difference between the two reasons given for Shabbat. In Parashat Yitro, it says, Ki sheisha yamim asa Hashem et hashamayim v'et ha'aretz, et hayam v'et kol asher bam, v'yinach b'yom hashvi'i al kein barach Hashem et yom hashvat v'yikadshehu. The reason given for resting on the seventh day is because we're supposed to remember what Hashem did when creating the world, that after 6 days of creation, Hashem rested on the seventh day. But in Sefer Devarim, in Parashat VaEtchanan, our Parsha, the reason given is V'zacharta ki eved hayita be'aretz Mitzrayim v'yotziacha Hashem elkecha misham b'yad chazaka u'v'zora netiyah al kein sivcha Hashem elkecha la'asod ad yom haShabbat. That the reason given for keeping Shabbat is to remember when we were slaves in Egypt, and to remember that we're no longer slaves, and that after 6 days of the week of working, we're able to take one day off, Shabbat, and rest. The Hoel Moshe explains why there's such a significant difference between these two reasons given for Shabbat. He explains that when the Aseret HaDibrot were first given, Bnei Israel was a fledgling nation. They had just come out of slavery in Mitzrayim in Egypt. And imagine if Hashem was to try to tell them that the reason you should rest on Shabbat is because you were slaves and you get a day of rest. That would be a concept that would be totally foreign to them. They didn't understand what it meant to be a free person, to have a day that they could rest, to take a day off, a day as their own. That wouldn't make any sense to them. That wouldn't be an idea they can comprehend at all. But when Hashem explained it to them as, you should rest just like I rested. I am God and I rested after 6 days. So that was a concept that they could see, they can have inspiration to look towards. That's an idea that they can start to comprehend. But to give them an idea of just throwing away this reality that they were so used to for so long, that's just an idea that wouldn't have been possible for them to even understand and put into practice. And the Hoel Moshe explains that this is like when a child asks a question about a certain mitzvah. We have many mitzvot that it can be very difficult to explain to a child why we do them. What's all the reasoning behind them? What's the story behind them? And we know many times from either our childhood and our upbringing and our education or the way we work with children that you can't always give the same answer that you give to a child that you give to an adult. There are just different ways that people approach the world, and there are different ways that people understand the world and the mitzvot. And it doesn't mean one is true and one is false. Obviously, we wouldn't be lying to a child. We want to tell them the truth, but there are also different ways of approaching it. So I think that the Hoel Moshe's approach is really interesting to say that there's really these two ways of approaching Shabbat and understanding Shabbat. There's understanding Shabbat as inspired by Hashem's day of rest and trying to elevate ourselves to be godlike in that way. And there's also a way of saying, no, we really want human beings to take a day of rest. And this is important to let yourself take a day of rest and let your workers take a day of rest. But for fledgling nation that was just coming out of slavery, that wouldn't have been something that they understood. And I think that this teaches us an important lesson that we learn in Mishlei. The pasuk of Chanoch l'na'ar al pi darko, that we should teach children according to their way, and that we can learn that there are many different ways to approach a topic and to approach a question and to approach mitzvot. Sometimes the answer is appropriate for one generation, and sometimes there's another answer that's more appropriate for a different generation. It doesn't mean anyone is more true or not as correct. They're both correct. They just can mean different things at different times. And I think that that's a lesson that we can take into our own lives when approaching questions that we might have, different ways we relate to what we're learning, and different ways we teach Torah to people at different ages or at different places in their lives. Shabbat Shalom.